And welcome back to World Energy Week. I'm John Defterios in London. We're all around the world for the World Energy Council here as we have this three-day session. I'm kind of the person in between hosting on this Wednesday, and a fantastic sessions that we've had so far, going to Latin America, looking at humanizing energy. And our next session that's going to be chaired by Helima Croft of RBC Capital Markets. It's all about the money, money, money. And that's multidimensional, of course, because of ESG policies that we have today, but also the money flowing into the hydrocarbon sector has been underinvested for the last 2 years during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's why we see oil prices hovering around $80 a barrel, the surge in natural gas prices, as we talked about a little bit earlier, a super cycle for the very strategic minerals and metals that are needed for the energy transition at the same time. But we thought we'd take a pause at this stage to kind of get a sense of what's taking place in the markets, what's taking place with OPEC Plus, and are we in this space in between? We see strong hydrocarbon prices right now because of the COVID-19 recovery, but we don't have the full investment cycle completed, of course, for renewable energy. Let's bring in Helima Croft, who's going to be chairing the next session, but is known very much as one of the leading energy strategists, particularly when it comes to the oil and gas sector. She joins us from Lower Manhattan in New York. This is a very global seminar, but it's good to pick her brain. It's good to see you again, number one.
It's great to see you, John.
I was just taking a look at prices and where they are in London right now, and I'm sure you've taken a peek in the last hour. Brent at $81.10, and we're looking at WTI at $77.50. And it's interesting because we're covering the energy transition during this World Energy Week, but you cannot ignore the elephant in the room, if you will, right? Because prices are high, and it gives us a sense it's almost like a super cycle coming out of COVID-19. What is driving this? Is it the underinvestment that I was just talking about?
I mean, it depends really on what market we're talking about. I mean, oil, as you mentioned, is at multi-year highs. I mean, we have this big economic recovery story from COVID. It was led by China. We've seen in the United States really strong gasoline demand. And so there is this real recovery and demand story. But I think what's really front and center right now is the question about this gas crisis that we're seeing in Europe, the energy crunch that we're seeing in China. I mean, it was incredible last week to have the Chinese say, all hands on deck. We need all forms of energy immediately because we're looking at really serious power shortages that could really impact Chinese growth. And so one of the big questions that I think, policymakers have to contend with right now is the real question about what is the optimal energy mix, because we really are seeing, pretty profound natural gas shortages. Questions about if we have a cold winter, is there enough gas in the system? As you mentioned, companies cut their operating budgets last year because of COVID, laid off workers. Now we have this recovery. And the question is there enough gas for a cold winter? And will you potentially need more oil as a substitution? And so when you want to think about OPEC, they really play this role as a central banker of the oil market. And the question will be, as prices, if they continue to rise because of concerns about increased demand, not just with COVID, but now this gas substitution, will they have to put more oil on the market?
Yeah, in fact, let's talk about this OPEC Plus meeting. Abdulaziz bin Salman, Prince Abdulaziz, is very communicative. But I was watching that from London. I was like, okay, where is the communication here? There was no guidance. Yes. And I think that is not going to settle very well. Do you think?
I think, John, this is so interesting. We've spent so many years in that basement in Vienna covering OPEC meetings. And OPEC as of late has really been giving forward guidance. And you think about Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, he really talks about himself as like the Greenspan of the oil markets. And I do think, we've had 2 monthly meetings now without any real OPEC commentary. And so we're not getting a sense right now of how OPEC is potentially thinking about an increase in demand. What would be a catalyst for OPEC to put more barrels on the market than just the 400,000 per month that they agreed to this summer. And so what I think is really interesting is we had an OPEC meeting with no statement, and yet we had Amin Nasser, CDO of Saudi Aramco, saying at a different forum that very day that right now we have an additional demand for oil of 500,000 barrels per day because of the whole gas crisis. So I do think it's going to be imperative to see what OPEC is prepared to do. Are they prepared to really play that global regulator role and essentially put more barrels on the market as needed? What is the catalyst for action, I think, is the real question.
Well, it's always refreshing to talk to you because we can have a very frank conversation about this. At what point does this backfire on OPEC, that it's not putting all the pre-COVID-19 production back onto the market? Because you don't want to be blamed for killing off the recovery, right?
I think this is a really fine line they have to watch. I mean, John, again, remember, we were in Vienna in March of 2020 when that meeting took place, that they could not come up with an agreement to cut production. And that was the onset, then the trigger for this price war that, really was a huge, huge economic challenge globally. And so I do think now that we're kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, where there are questions about, should OPEC put more barrels on the market? I do think it will be important, relatively soon, if we continue to have these concerns about a deepening energy crisis, to know exactly what metrics they're looking at for additional action at a minimum.
This is a very interesting dynamic, and you're sitting in Lower Manhattan on Wall Street there, and we know the power of ESG, the money that's been allocated by pension funds, right, by university holdings like in Harvard or Yale and the rest, and they don't want to have any of their money going into hydrocarbons if it's not clean, right? So what happens going forward? This is that space in between where Wall Street, London, very cognizant, Frankfurt, of ESG principles. Who's going to invest in hydrocarbons? Is it going to be the international state oil companies of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Russia, Nigeria? Who are the players?
Yeah, it's the region you know so well, John. I mean, just think about, which companies are talking about the all of the above investment strategy. It is the ADNOCs, it is the Saudi Aramcos, it's Kuwait Petroleum Corporation. Like, they're talking about essentially making investments in the technologies and the energy of the future, the solar, the hydrogen. At the same time, they're saying we're going to continue to invest in conventional upstream capacity. I mean, Aramco came out with the announcement, on Monday, that they're going to boost production to 13 million barrels a day. You've had similar statements from ADNOC about really, pretty ambitious expansion plans for upstream investment. And so we will have a situation, even if the pie shrinks, you're going to have a pie dominated increasingly by the low-cost producers. And what they would say is, not only are they the low-cost producers, but they have the lowest emissions footprint per barrel. So they would say, we're the cheapest and the greenest. So essentially, we're going to be the last man standing in this market.
Okay, final thing before we toss it over to you for your very interesting session that's pending right now. What does this mean for COP26 if you have gas shortages, very high oil prices, consumers struggling after COVID-19, but then we have a medium-term target on climate change? Does it impact COP26 where the climate agenda starts to slide back? Consumers are saying, look, I just can't afford energy.
John, I think this is the most essential question right now for policymakers. How do you balance these ambitious net zero climate targets with the whole issue of energy access? And I think there is growing concern that if you have consumers not able to heat their homes, again, if we have an unseasonably cold winter and people cannot heat their homes, the skyrocketing utility bills, are you going to have consumers essentially say, I want affordable, reliable energy, and I don't care about the emissions footprint of that energy. I just want to be able to heat my homes. And do you get a populist backlash against renewables policies? Like, I think we already started to see that in France, remember, with the yellow vests? Do we get a revival of that movement? I think that is something that policymakers are really going to have to try to ward off as they go into COP26. How do you balance access with these ambitious climate goals?
Yeah, as we were talking about here, and the theme of the World Energy Week has been humanizing energy, right? And this is a session I chaired in the afternoon. It goes to the heart of what you're talking about. That is a human factor here, what the consumer wants. That's Helima Croft. She's in New York, and we're going to go right back to her for her session. Just want to remind our viewers that we have a couple of hashtags. Helima is waiting for your questions on the digital platform that we're using right now, and add the hashtags World Energy Week and Humanizing Energy. These are that is the key central theme that we're focused on in 2021, leading into the World Energy Summit that we're going to be having with the World Energy Council in St. Petersburg next year. We're going to take a short video sting, and then we're going to go right back to Helima, and she'll pick it up in New York.
And we are back. I am super excited to chair this World Energy Week session on It's All About the Money, 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 or is it? Against a backdrop of investment rebounding this year as the world begins its recovery from COVID-19, the dynamics of ESG, net zero ambitions, and social license are affecting investment choices and assets. ESG has become a risk filter for institutional investors, but the social in ESG is being weighed up secondarily to environmental and governance considerations where energy investments are concerned. Moreover, an honest conversation on market price, system cost, and affordability is needed now, especially as affordability is more than about simply ability to pay. To dive into these topics, we are very lucky to have with us an exceptional panel of experts and global energy thought leaders. Please allow me to introduce them. We have Philippe Gilbert, Senior Advisor to the Secretary General of the World Energy Council, Jim Barry, Chief Investment Officer of BlackRock Alternatives Investors and Global Head of BlackRock Real Assets, Paul Appleby, Chief Insights Officer of the World Energy Council, and we have Guillermo de Saint-Malo, Chief Executive Officer, Electric Group Panama. So to begin with, we are going to have each of our speakers make opening statements, and then afterwards, we will dive further into the conversation. So Philippe, will you kick us off?
Afternoon. Thank you. After the introduction that we had, I thought that perhaps I can take a step back and get out of the next winter and try to have a shorter look to like 1,000 years and look at what we really mean when we talk about net zero, because I think this is the center of all. We have net zero have been restarting in the Paris Agreement in 2015. But it was there for a long time already. And now we are looking in the road to Glasgow to a flurry of net zero initiative. And as it has been said, a lot of billions going in this area. We have to remember that net zero is a concept which is scientifically proven only for the globe or for large territory that have their own natural carbon sink. So to use that for business and for portfolio, it's a little touchy because first you have to discuss the scope. And obviously the companies are much wider than just what they have inside their walls. Second, you have to discuss the trajectory because the point of arrival is much less interesting than the curve that you are using to the travel. And thirdly, we have to be very, very, very cautious about all this compensation offset that the financial market is putting now, right or not, in front of real emission. So all this to me, that means that now what we really need for the market, because the money is really going in that direction, is the effort of definition to avoid, because I was interested about your definition about opportunities and investment. But perhaps what the people, you should forget green or black or brown. You should discuss about stranded and not stranded. And perhaps this is the main interesting line between where you should put your investments.
Thank you so much. Jim, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Helima, and great to be with you all today. Look, I think the challenge the financial markets face is no different to everyone else, policymakers, corporates, et cetera, is that there's no off-the-shelf roadmap that takes the world to net zero in such a short 30 to 40-year time frame. And in addition, the complexity of the challenge is exacerbated as every country and region will have to tailor its roadmap to its starting point, its resources in the broader sense, and its political and economic context. And in addition, while the scale of what needs to be achieved, I think, has been internalized to some extent by the markets, I don't believe the markets truly appreciate the implication of the required pace of transition. But irrespective, the capital is beginning to flow with increasing unstoppable momentum, and we'll strive to make judgments in this environment about good versus bad. But it's highly uncertain, and we can consequently expect a volatile and disruptive path unless we get real clarity of regulation and policy at both national, regional, and global levels. And this is a world where, in my view, the best can be the enemy of the good, as time is not our friend, and delays will only add to the pain and cost of transition. Just picking up on your earlier comments, just preceding the panel, you know, policymakers, it's really a Hobson's choice. I mean, there is no Goldilocks solution here. You know, kind of, we have an embedded cost of climate change already we're going to have to deal with. And so, you know, kind of that the populist dynamics will not remove and deal with the science, as Philippe said. And so I think that there is a real challenge for policymakers, and they've got to take that long-term perspective and try and manage the short-term challenges, not unlike we are dealing with in Europe this winter. And I also, in that context, I think capital will need to get used to the gray rather than black or white of transition, and accept some of the uncertainties as a price to pay on this journey. And I think gas is one of the ones that plays into that gray as we think about it. And as I said, that for now, that capital will also have to adapt to a warmer climate with the cost of 1.5 degrees plus already embedded, if you believe the IPCC. So back to you.
Great, thank you. Paul, what are your thoughts?
I'll start where Jim was starting, the scale of the challenge. I think we get a sense of that from looking at, say, the IEA's net zero scenario. Other scenarios are available, but that one will tell us we need to roughly double the amount of investment in the energy sector to about $5 trillion per annum around 2030. Big numbers. But there's no shortage of capital to meet that kind of requirement for capital. The problem is the scale and pace required in terms of bringing forward investable projects. Projects are, of course, implemented by companies or communities or even households putting a solar panel on the roof or getting a new heat pump. What the finance sector does is set some context for those decisions by making available funds on certain terms, at a certain interest rate, and maybe applying ESG standards. So the finance sector does have a big role to play. There's been increasing attention to ESG and climate. I also sit on a board of a pension fund, and certainly over the last 2 years, there's been a significant ramping up in the attention we're paying to climate. Tomorrow we've got a committee meeting. We'll spend half the time on climate reporting and governance. But there's really two big challenges for the finance sector. One is it can't do it on its own. So it needs policymakers to set the policy context. It needs industry and communities to provide the supply chains, the skilled workforce, the first mover customers to create investable projects. And second, of course, finance needs to learn how to deal with a whole new set of risks. So the traditional way that finance looks at things is return versus risk. And it's got historical data on risk and return. A lot of that is inapplicable in this uncharted water we're going into. The ESG, the climate risks we just don't really know how to measure them. So there's a big challenge in the metrics and the risk analysis that's required to figure out exactly how the capital should flow. That's certainly the case for mainstream finance, where you're worrying about the financial return. It's even more the case if you're an impact investor. You want not just a financial return, but you actually want impact as well. Again, you need a whole lot of new metrics developed to make sure you're having the impact that you intend.
Thank you so much. And Guillermo, what are your opening thoughts? Guillermo, could you unmute yourself?
Sorry, my bad. So leaving from the general to specific, it depends on where you are in the world. Obviously, one is capital contributions, capital costs, but some of these countries depend on where they are in the world to see what they can do. I totally agree that we should be comfortable with the imperfect, because there's some small steps that we can take now to build out our energy systems in a more green way. If you look at the steps that Puerto Rico is taking, they're going full ahead in going as green as possible in a very fast manner. There are some regulations that have to be implemented, but also the cost of capital needs to be there in order to make it viable. One of the great things is that because this is a blank canvas, you can actually deploy cleaner energy in most of these places.
So I want to stick with, you talked about different geographies. I wanted to just follow up with you quickly on the question about energy access. And, as you think about developing nations and how they have to sort of manage coming up with net zero policies while at the same time, providing access to affordable, reliable energy that they need to meet their essential development goals. I mean, how are countries in your region thinking about that? What are the differing approaches and what are the challenges?
Well, the challenges today is how do we provide energy to remote places, be that because there are less fortunate people, be that because there are tourism areas that you want to deploy. You need to take energy there. And to take energy there, you do microgrids. The wonderful thing about this is that while you provide energy to these remote places, you actually include all these people in the formal economies. They can get access to health. They can get access to education. Obviously, with that, they can get access to a formal economy. They can get access to credit. And if we can deploy that in a greener way, it is a way to include all these people in the formal economy. Give you an example. We today run 19 microgrids. There is a small little village in the frontier between Panama and Colombia. There was no energy there until 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago. Today, that energy is provided by solar, battery, and the delta with a small diesel generator. Obviously, it's a very small community, but now that community is thriving in tourism, and the kids actually could go to school during pandemia. They would have not been able to go to school in pandemia if energy was not there. So that is a way that countries like ours and in our neighbors are challenging that. One of the challenges, somebody touched on this, and I can't remember who it was, is the norms that the governments need to put in place in order for that to be the catalyst to do these investments, need to be there first. If the norms and regulations are not there, then you cannot attract the capital to provide these solutions to these people.
I want to stick with this theme of government policy because that's something that was weaving through all of the statements that were made is needing the right enabling policy from governments. And so I want to start with Jim on this, but I want to put this to all of our panelists. What is essential from the policymaker standpoint? What do we need to have happen from governments to drive this investment? And one of the questions I am always thinking about is do you need to have a price for carbon? How essential is that for essentially driving the essential investment to the key industry? So Jim, I'm going to give that to you first. What policy enabling environment are you looking for?
So Helima, look, we're talking about the complete transformation of our model of energy and power. And so, if we wait for the market to do that without any extra stimulation on the back of, let's call it consumer choice, which is already a big driver, it's going to take forever and not in any way in the time frame that's required to address the challenge of climate change. And so you need policymakers to step in and create some context for new investment, essentially, and have a view, particularly, and it's complex because it's got to be done by country, by region, it's all different, but have a view of where you're going, essentially. And you may not have all the answers, but directionally be there. What are you doing around efficiency? What are you doing in terms of decarbonizing the electricity generation? How are you going to deal with the more complex sort of energy challenges like heat and large-scale transport? These are things to be addressed by policymakers. Now, there's no question a carbon price would be a very clean way of getting at it, right? But that's, depending where you are, could be a challenge. And certainly for something which is a common good, trying to get a global common good, trying to get a global policy of that is going to be next to impossible in the short term. So what you're going to find is you're going to find carbon tax playing out in different ways, whether it's incentives in terms of grants or whether it's in terms of tax credits or whatever it may be. In effect, you're going to have that done in a kind of in a way that's sort of segmented and differentiated across markets and countries. But the reality is, there is no question in my mind, the easiest way and the quickest way to really drive this change is to go and put a framework in place on a pan-regional or global basis around carbon pricing, essentially, because that in turn then will allow the market very efficiently and effectively address it. I don't think we're getting that anytime soon.
Paul, what are you looking for? Thank you. In terms of what is the enabling environment? And can I add to that? Do you think we're going to get from COP26 some sort of clear signpost in terms of like, you know, what the global policy framework will be?
Well, I'm an economist, so I'm going to start where Jim was. You know, it would be great if we had a carbon price, a global carbon pricing system. That's the ideal, but we're not going to get there anytime soon. So there'll be a patchwork of putting a value on carbon in various different ways. It'll need to be backed up by regulation, policy of different types. And the carbon price can only do so much. There are some things when you're transforming a system that require kind of strategic direction from government, like coordinating the whole grid. There needs to be some kind of strategic intervention by government, going beyond purely a carbon price. Are we going to get that from COP26? My forecasting ability for COPs is not great. I'd like to hope that we get some really clear signals out of COP. And they've had long enough to think about it. They've had the whole pandemic to think about what they're going to do at COP26. Let's hope they can get together and come out with some really strong signals about where we need to go next.
Philippe, your thoughts on the policy framework that's necessary?
There are a lot, but I will choose one. As far as I can remember, we have always been doing business, taking nature for granted, unlimited, and stable. And unfortunately, what we are seeing now is that these three hypotheses on which we have based our business, we based our declaration of profit, we based our dividends, we based our big bonus, are wrong. So either we attack this immediately, and one of the things could be to put a price on carbon, or we will never make the right decision. We will continue to call profit, which is nothing else than abusing natural capital. So as long as government doesn't take this, I don't think we will move fast enough, given the urgency.
And Guillermo, finally, your thoughts on the policy framework that's required.
Well, I take it then again local. I think depending on where you are in the world or where your circumstances are. Look at the price of energy today in Spain, because their dependency on gas, right? Very different to a different market, you know, like Brazil or Paraguay. So I think rules and regulations need to be adapted to the characteristics of the countries. You know, what energy access do they have? Can they do 100% renewable? Can they do a big percentage renewable? I mean, it depends on the characteristics of the country. What I do feel is that there needs to be an emergency push towards the governments to make those policy changes today, at least to do a path, you know, what is step A, step B, step C. And some countries have made some good decisions in the last 6 months, but most have not.
So you mentioned the crisis that we're seeing in Spain in terms of, you know, gas shortages. A question I put to everybody is, you know, what does net zero actually mean for investment portfolios? Like, what counts as green? I mean, this big debate we're having over natural gas, like what role it should play in the transition. You know, where does nuclear come in? Like, what actually, when you think about designing the portfolio, you know, what is actually green? So I'm going to put that. I'm always putting Jim on the hot seat, but I'm going to start with Jim on this.
Thanks. Happy to be on the hot seat, Helima. So look, I mean, like, you got to see, first of all, net zero in the broader sustainability context. And I would say to you, institutions with the capital, the pension funds, insurance companies, foundations, they're thinking about it more broadly. There's no question climate and net zero is the elephant in the sustainability room, but they are thinking about social and they are thinking about governance. And they're looking for their asset managers like BlackRock to give them options in that context. And I think that, you know, and that's really accelerated in the last 3 or 4 years. And it's not all institutions born equal. I think your European institutions are going to be much further ahead of, let's call it, certain states in the United States, where the public pension plans in states where, say, oil is a major product. So it's not all born equal, but the momentum is very real. And so what they're coming to then in allocation is they're looking to see, can they, where across fixed income, across equities, across alternatives, They're looking to see, can they allocate into sustainable products, stuff that applies ESG criteria, and particularly as it relates to net zero, are they investing into asset class where the underlying entities issuing the securities, that they're committed in some way to net zero? And so someone like BlackRock, where we have a massive stewardship function, we're very focused on engaging with the corporate community around net zero and path to net zero. And I think that, we're also then, we run one of the largest asset management risk systems, Aladdin. We're putting information into Aladdin Climate, with a view to giving our clients the ability to make judgments. But we're really in the foothills of this. And I think that data point is absolutely critical. We're lacking standard taxonomies across these issues, across all the ESG criteria. We're lacking any sort of, time series availability of transparent data about these issues. And that's an area that's going to get huge focus, because that ultimately is what allowed the wholesale kind of reallocation of capital.
Yeah. Thank you. Philippe, do you want to jump in on this as well in terms of what does net zero actually mean and what counts as green?
Yeah, and the first thing we have to understand, because we are all focusing on companies that claim they are net zero. They cannot be net zero. The role of a company is to participate, to build a society net zero. And this is where the point of Jim is so important. We have no clue today of where the data is and how to use the data to decide if a company is more or less in the right direction compared to another. It's very complex at the moment. And this is probably where I see the most dangerous situation. We are starting to put billions in areas that are not safe, and we don't really know. And all this discussion now in Europe about is gas green, and I am French, as you said, so is nuclear green? That's right. If you are sure, is nuclear green? I have a good news for you. All the candidates to the next presidential election in France are going for nuclear now. So it could be a start of an answer for you. And by the way, I just wanted to rebound on what you said about Gilets jaunes, because I was there every Sunday in Paris seeing the Gilets jaunes breaking the Arc de Triomphe. And the Gilets jaunes were not against sustainability. They were against paying the price of sustainability, which is very different. So we should not mix the two things. Right. They were against non-equity, and which is something we have to rethink a little. We need World Energy Council has a marvelous definition on this triangle, this trilemma, and one of the point is equity. We need to find equity, but you need to respect sustainability.
That is, I like that, equity, but respecting sustainability. Paul, there's so much we could dive in on this. You are an economist. What do you think about the whole, argument about this lack of standard taxonomy? What counts as green? How do you look at this?
And for full disclosure, I worked for 36 years for BP. Of course, recently have announced their own net zero ambition. And originally I was a skeptic. I mean, for all the reasons that Philippe has listed, it's a problematic concept. Yeah. But what I realized is it's a very powerful communication tool. Right. So the net zero is a kind of rallying cry. If you want to demonstrate that you are taking climate change seriously and you want to be aligned with Paris goals, a net zero ambition statement is a simple way to do that. And it communicates externally, it communicates internally to staff. It's a very powerful communication tool. Of course, it can be misused. It could be used for virtual signaling rather than actually signaling your intent in action. But it has galvanized action. If you look at Climate Action 100 Plus, for example, as an investor group that tracks 167 companies who are all large emitters, 2 years ago, about a handful of them had net zero commitments. Now it's 120 plus. So over a couple of years, you've seen this the kind of rallying around the cry of net zero. If that translates into action, it's a good thing. But we absolutely echo everything that Philippe and others have said about the devil is in the detail. Once you try and actually unpick it and compare one net zero with another, you get into a lot of problems.
And can I just, before I turn to Guillermo, I want to just follow up on this, because is there a risk if you have different definitions of what counts as an acceptable path to net zero? I mean, Philippe mentioned, every French presidential candidate will back nuclear, but we have a position of the German government that seems to be, very strongly against nuclear. So, is there a risk in having, very different concepts, or is it an all of the above? Is that a fine way to proceed? So I'm going to stick with you, Paul, on that one, and then bring in everybody.
Yeah, so let's stick on the positive. If net zero at least brings people together to say, yeah, look, we're all aligned with Paris. Now, what does that mean? You at least create a dialogue and get some forward momentum. If you then start arguing about, well, my net zero is better than your net zero, then it's going to have a negative impact. So it's a careful balancing act, and there is a need for standardization, some better appreciation of metrics, which needs to be handled kind of separately. So we need somebody to step forward or institutions to step forward and start creating, as objective as they can, a set of metrics that everyone can start to agree on. But yeah, I think it's a great rallying cry, but if you try and use it to compare one with the other, then you do get into problems.
Guillermo, your thoughts on this? Great rallying cry, but
I think I have little to add after I heard everyone here. I mean, net zero is the end game, and the end game is what are the paths that we need to do in order to get to eradicate emissions. And in some areas we can go faster, and if we can somehow be catalyst to other groups, other companies, other countries to follow this path, we will get there faster. It is not defined exactly, and at this moment, as you say, we need to get some indicators on how we measure it, but we know what are important paths that we need to take in order to eradicate a big portions of the emissions, and that is what we need to tackle today.
We're going to be opening it up for questions. Oh, sorry. Who was that?
I was going to say, Helima, I was going to jump in there. I was going to say, look, every country will decide, or maybe a region like the EU will decide its own thing. I mean, if 70% of your power generation mix is nuclear, like you're going to use nuclear, right? Okay, and you'd be insane not to use nuclear. If you're in Ireland, like I live, you're not going to use a lot of solar. Okay, you're going to use a lot of wind, and so you've got to allow the flexibility of countries to find their own path that takes account of their own circumstances, their legacy assets, their political and economic context. But I do think in the mix, there will be some commonality. I mean, we will electrify mobility substantially, and there's nothing straight line is the other thing you got to understand from here. Everything is going to be exponential in its impact and its nature. And so we will electrify mobility. We're going to have to find a solution for some more challenging elements of mobility. Maritime and aviation, we got to find solutions for heat. But I do think how we then decarbonize electricity will depend on where you are. And, we can divert on what works, doesn't work. I wouldn't be building too many new nuclear plants if I wanted to impact anything in the next 20 years and be cost effective. But the reality, I'd keep all my old nuclear open as long as I could. And so, these are the dynamics that country by country, region by region, one will have to work out. And to pick up on Guillermo's point, I think that this is great for ultimately developing an emerging market if we can get the capital there. And that's a question, right? Okay, because there are challenges to get large-scale institutional capital deployed in emerging and developing markets. But there's no question new technologies like wind, solar, batteries, and the microgrids that he spoke about can democratize energy and power to communities who have no access to it now, no access to it at any price. It's not a price issue. And really have a transformative effect and get to the equity point that's been made. And so, this is an exciting time, but demanding on all the incumbents.
Can I just follow what you just said about, getting enough capital to emerging markets? I mean, how big of a issue is that proving to be right now?
So look, there's a challenge, and this is just emerging markets, developing markets are challenged generally with respect to capital, right? You've got currency issues, you've got rule of law issues, you've got potentially business corruption issues, land right issues. So a whole range of issues that are very hard to manage. And institutional capital is, you think about most institutions, bonds and investment grade bonds tend to be the ballast in the portfolio. So the appetite, it's not about I need a higher return for that kind of risk. It's just I have no capital for that kind of risk. And so I think this is where managers like ourselves need to work with multilaterals to come up with structures and methods of getting capital deployed in a safe way for the institutions. We've launched raising capital for a a climate finance fund where we have some catalytic capital from the French and German governments and some foundations to basically a first loss provision behind which stands the institutional capital, specifically designed for renewable power generation in emerging markets. So it's small, it's $500 million plus or minus that we'll raise, but it's about trying to crack a model. And I think that's where we have to work with governments and multilateral agencies in particular, and particularly allocate certain risks to those entities. But that's where capital will be needed, and we will have to find a solution.
Guillermo, I mean, you sit in one of these, key emerging economies. Right? How big is the challenge of attracting capital to countries like your own?
Panama is not the best case because Panama is a little more attractive, but it's a very small country. Now, it is not only capital, there is a cost of debt. You go to Europe, for example, and you're going to do a solar play, and you get, debt at 2.5%. You're going to do a solar play in Colombia, you're going to get charged 7%. So it's not only the cost of capital, it's the cost of debt. So if we want to migrate from coal in Colombia to, say, solar and wind and others, not only the capital to be attractive, but also the cost of debt that accompanies the capital needs to have a policy of some sort, maybe with international finance institutions, as Jim suggested, but that cost of debt needs to be a lot more competitive, because if not, then the transition is virtually, not impossible, but the end consumer can't pay, the cost of electricity because it's too high. And also, it is upon the wealthier and the big companies in our countries also to do the first investments and the first leaps in order for others to follow. I think there is a responsibility play on the important groups in our countries to, to put their money where their mouth is.
Paul, you're an economist. I mean, how are you thinking about the sort of investment challenge for developing nations?
Well, I think it's already been said. It's essentially about the pricing of that credit flow, which will be taking into account sovereign risk, will be taking into account the credit strength of whoever's ultimately paying for the solar panels or whatever it is. There are policies you can put in place, or multilaterals can help you with those things, but it's a fundamental issue for emerging markets, irrespective of clean energy or energy transitions. They have an issue around attracting debt. And
Philip, do you have any thoughts on this as well?
Just one, perhaps, but I don't have the answer to what Jim has. How can you? The problem is the massification of flow that we have to organize in an issue which is still not very well defined. And as he said, there is a lot of color between black and white that we have to evaluate. So how come we can organize a flow of finance that feels safe and gets the profit or the rentability they need without yet knowing exactly where it will be directed? For me, this is the big question that I'm seeing now in the months to come.
So I want to tell all of our audience members that you can submit questions through the link. And so we would be very eager and excited to take your questions. But before we turn it over to questions, I wanted just to go back to COP26. And I want to get every panelist's view on what their expectations are coming out of COP26, and how important is this upcoming, global meeting in Glasgow for, setting the right environment to attract investment into these really important net zero sectors. So I'm going to stick with you, Philippe, on your expectations from COP26, and does this matter?
I think we are at the point, it has been said before, but we are at the point where the finance world should stand for what they committed in Paris. We have 100 billion elephant in the room every year, which has not been yet solved. And it's, for me, the key to our credibility toward developing country. First, we should go back to the key issue. We tend to go into very complex, but the reality is that we have to stop emission, and as soon as we can. So the rest is discussion, detail, etc. But stop emission, I hope it will be achieved in Glasgow.
Excellent. Paul, your expectations on COP26?
So I'm not very good at forecasting these, but I mean, the expectation was set at Paris that there would be this continual ratcheting up of commitments and monitoring. Hopefully that really gets solidified at COP26. So we really see serious attempts to look at progress so far and ratchet up beyond that, so that we are on a path that can meet the Paris goals. A possible, something that hasn't really had a lot of attention so far in the Paris Agreement was adaptation. So we've talked a lot about mitigation. Adaptation was in the Paris Agreement. There's been an awful lot of extreme weather events recently. I think that might shift some people's minds onto, well, what could or should we be doing about adaptation coming out of COP26? So watch that space. There might be something on adaptation.
Fantastic. Jim, your thoughts on this? Because, I mean, certainly Fatih Birol at the IEA has been really warning that we are not acting fast enough. And so what are your expectations of COP26? And what do you think we need to see coming out of the meetings in Glasgow?
So look, I think, without doubt, we'll have basically a doubling down on the net zero commitment, okay? And I think that at some level, they'll try and get certain countries to accelerate where they're at. But I do think it will mark really a point of no return in terms of momentum from policymakers globally. I think, and this is the challenge, I think for there to be real progress in COP26, China and the United States need to come to agreement around some common set of ambitions. And that's a big challenge in the broader context of their relationship. And I think that, China, from their position saying, it can't be a little oasis of engagement and constructive cooperation. We need to look at more broadly our relationship, United States. And I think that's the challenge, because there's a lot packed into that broad relationship. Yes. And so whether that can get sort of, to a point where it gets beyond the platitudes is a hard one. But I think that ultimately, we have to look at if China and the United States lead, Europe obviously a factor, and no ambiguity where Europe is, the EU is certainly, and the UK alongside. I think that, but it's really US and China where we're at if we're going to see dramatic, what I would call, progress. But other than that, I think it is important. It is important. And I think it really benefits for coming in 2021 and not 2020, post this extraordinary experience we've all shared, where something exogenous to our economic and financial systems has had such almost an existential impact that requires the most dramatic of monetary and fiscal interventions to save our world. I think it's a much better context for progress. But beyond kind of just the doubling down and literally creating a sense of no going back, hard to see all these issues resolved. But still optimistic for that alone.
Can I just get one quick follow-up before I go to Guillermo, because you brought up the elephant in the room on the US-China relationship. Do you have an expectation that cooperation on climate can be sort of unbundled from these other broader issues in the US-China relationship? I mean, if you were, in your crystal ball, how do you think this is going to evolve?
This is where I need my colleague Tom Donlan beside me to advise me. Look, I think China very clear. We want to see it done in a broader context. The US would very much like to deal with it in isolation. I think you will ultimately get to something that's in between. I think that's inevitably it. Because I do think China itself understands the challenge of climate change, the embedded cost of not addressing it, its requirement for societal stability. And I think, the Biden administration also gets it. The US is far more challenging, and let's not get to, whatever the administration agrees, whether that ultimately can be, kind of implemented by a Congress. But certainly, I do think there's enough aligned interest to get somewhere. Whether it gets done for COP26 is another matter.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Guillermo, your thoughts on COP26. What do you expect to come out of this, gathering? What do you think needs to come out of COP26?
I would add that that disconnect from developing nations needs to be addressed. in the terms that, we talk about what Europe's going to do and obviously what balance needs to happen between China and the US, but there's always this disconnect on what's going to happen in developing nations. And if we're going to follow a path, then our expectation is to have at least a chronogram of small milestones in order to follow in this lead of developed nations. And for some reason, developing nations are still disconnected from this, important path that we all need to take, and the fact that we harbor so many people, and the fact that we need to make so many important changes in order to change our matrix, we need to correct that disconnect.
Thank you. So we are getting some questions in, and I think I'm going to give this one actually to Philippe, because he brought up the whole issue of protests that were in his country a few years ago. And this question I'm getting is that there have been uprisings related to the dynamics around the energy transition all over the world, from Latin America to Lebanon to France. What does this mean for governments as they try to balance their policies? And so, you already brought this up, Philippe, so I want you to take us, your thoughts on this.
But the crisis that we are seeing, and I am no expert to discuss why the origin, as you have done brightly just before, is just a question of being transparent. We have to explain to the people that what we are seeing is just a normal price. The fact that we are not putting a price on carbon, as it has been said before, doesn't mean that the carbon has no cost. It's just that we are sending the bill to the next generation. So we have to explain this. And surprisingly, when you start explaining this, people understand. They just don't understand why they have to pay the bill now when they have not benefited from the profit of having sending all this carbon in the atmosphere. But I think if we don't tackle this seriously, explaining, then we will have social disruption much wider than just 2 or 3 gilets jaunes in the streets, because the facts are there. We have to explain this difference.
Jim, do you have any thoughts? Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to come in on that. So look, Philippe, so I get it, but I actually think the cost is being borne today. And I think and I've been 20 years in this space, and I think in the last 3 years, there's been a massive shift in what I would call public mood on this. And I'm talking about not just in Europe, I'm talking generally. And I think a big reason is the cost is now being borne today. It's been borne there in the consequences of these extreme weather events that are taking place all over the world. It's there in property and life and damage. So that, I think, has changed the equation. That's why the policymakers have responded in a way they hadn't heretofore. It's because the public are now beginning to understand they're paying a price today. It was one thing when it was islands in the Pacific and 2100 and 2050. It seemed like so far away. It's another thing when your state is on fire, like California is, kind of most summers now. It's when 3 months of rain falls in a few hours and has catastrophic flooding implications. In developed economies, and it's no longer away; it's come home. And I think that more than anything else is giving the politicians the scope to take the tough actions they need. A lot more communication around some of the trade-offs required, but certainly I think they've got much more flexibility for action than they've had heretofore.
So we're actually coming up on the last sort of 5 minutes of our session today. And I wanted to get your closing remarks, but maybe I could, weave into that another question that we just caught in terms of like, what advice would you give to policymakers who need to make rapid change without drastically impacting the attractiveness of private investment in their country? So if you want to weave that in, you can, but I would love to get everyone's sort of closing thoughts as we bring this session to an end. Jim, you're on the screen, so your closing thoughts are right down the line.
I thought you'd give me a break this last time, Helima. But
no, you're on my screen, so.
Yeah, so I'm stuck. I think my closing comment would be, I think we've hit a massive pivot point as it relates to addressing the challenge of climate change. And I think capital, back to the title of our session, money, is going to be a massive driver of the change. And if companies, whether in the energy and power complex or more generally, don't begin responding to the need to effectively, reduce emissions dramatically, then capital will get more expensive and it will dry up. And I think that that's just reality. That momentum is very real and it's not going to stop. I think for policymakers, the challenge is, to come up with some cohesion within their country region to the policy in a way that drives immediate action. But it has to be done with a sense of long term. I mean, if we are going to retrofit, buildings and homes for greater efficiency, you got to think about it in a 10 or 15 year time. You got to think about training up all the plumbers and electricians and other craftsmen and women you need to make these changes. And I think that, so that's the big challenge. It's not like there's no silver bullet here. It's the old adage, you're explaining, you're losing. It's a tough one. But the one thing I would say, I said in my opening, don't let the best become the enemy of the good. Any momentum is good. And so my advice to any policymaker is just take action. It may not be perfect, but take the action to move and correct it over time.
Paul, your closing thoughts. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Agree with that, but there's two big challenges. If you think about the finance sector internally, money, the issue is metrics. So it's getting really clear about how we measure and manage risk, how we measure impacts. So metrics, looking internally. Externally, it's how does the environment get set so that finance can do its work and help the transition? Policy we've talked about. So collectively, we need to put a value on carbon, but also individually. Things people can do as customers or as individual investors to signal that they put a value on these things. And that can help to shift the dial as well. So it's that combination of figuring out how to measure things internally, but externally to the finance sector, having the right kind of context.
Excellent. Guillermo, closing thoughts.
I think that the business sector in each country has a responsibility in order to promote and push for these changes. They are the leaders in terms of the economic sector, and I think they have a responsibility to act and push their local governments in order to make these policy changes. I think that these changes are just for Earth, just for your social impact, just for inclusion. I'm pretty confident that it is the right timing, as Jim says, that we have wind in the sail, and we need to start sailing because there's wind in the sail. There may be no wind next year, but we have wind now, so you need to sail away, and it's time to put some pressure into our governments.
That's excellent. And I'm going to have Philippe bring us home. I mean, I love the Guillermo comment that we have wind in our sails, time to sail. What are your closing thoughts? And how is there a risk that the wind could dissipate? I mean, do you think this is the wind is going to stay constant, or are there risks that if we don't act soon enough? So, Philippe, if you can just bring it all together for us.
Yeah, I will really take all what you have said. I said business is the solution. For the first time in Paris, business has been put in front of its responsibility as a solution, not as a problem. The only problem is that in business, we are competing animal. We like to compete. And then if you want business going in the right direction, government has to make his duty, which is to put the direction in place, which is the regulation. And after you put a price system that is fair and put business in the right direction. And so it's the price of carbon, et cetera, et cetera. If you do that, business has such an energy, such a possibility to invent things that I have no doubt that we will find a solution. But we have to put business in the right direction. It's urgent. It's really urgent.
Well, I think that is an exceptional note to end on in terms of the urgency of putting business in the right direction. And so I want to thank all of our panelists for what I think has been a really lively and enlightening session. Philippe, Jim, Paul, Guillermo, thank you so much for your time today. I'd like to thank the audience that listened in and sent in those wonderful questions. And I hope we can reconvene next year, and we believe that we have more wind in our sails. So thank you so much, everyone. And I will be handing it back to the organizers. Thank you.